side before the service. She was an older lady who had been active in many of the liberal social movements of the 1960s and proud of her involvement there. Her concern was over some of the language that she was hearing around the church, and particularly coming out of the UUA. "I'm not a white supremacist," she proclaimed to me. "I fought against white supremacists here, Texas, here and in the old days, and I will never be associated with them." This was, of course, the reaction of a good many liberals within Unitarian Universalism when this conversation around white supremacy began among us. It was, after all, one of the main reasons why the former president of the UUA, Peter Morales, had resigned, and it was also central to the election of our current UUA president, Susan Frederick Gray. She promised to continue the work that the interim co-presidents has kept in her commitment to make the UUA an anti-racist institution. Now, that said, the term white supremacy in the context of the present day Unitarian Universalism does trip people up from time to time. It tripped me up too at first. So if it's tripping you up, whenever you hear that term, white supremacy or white supremacy culture, then I invite you to join me on the journey that I'll relate to you this morning. In many ways, this sermon is kind of my more elaborate, detailed response to the concern that sweet, well-intentioned lady confronted me with all those years ago in San Antonio. Now, I don't purport to have all the answers, of course, but I do want to bring you along with me on my journey, how I've come to understand that term and the ethical quandaries it presents to our denomination. I think white supremacy as a term is like a Pavlovian bell. For some people, particularly folks who marched in the civil rights era, white supremacy conjures up images of the Ku Klux Klan burning crosses in yards, or overly aggressive police tactics, which we saw had tragic ends this summer. Now, for lack of a better term, and in many ways the challenge here is in our word usage, I'll call this the traditional use of the term white supremacy. However, words in our language grow and change. Their meanings expand beyond how they've been used in previous generations. So the meaning of white supremacy as a term has expanded beyond militias and hate groups. Nowadays, we use that term white supremacy in kind of a literal way. This newly expanded definition of white supremacy goes a little something like this. White supremacy is the underlying assumption, conscious or subconscious, that the cultural norms and expectations of white people are or should be universally accepted. Note that one need not state this outright, but rather it's an underlying assumption that the right way to do something is tied to the cultural experience of being white. Thus, the response to white supremacy culture by people of color has been to de-center these cultural assumptions and instead center the experiences of people of color in some way. So we might call this the modern definition of white supremacy. But how can this be, you might ask? In order to be a white supremacist, don't I have to choose to be one? Isn't racism a bias or behavior that I would be aware of as I go through my life? I'm not asking anyone to drink out of a different water fountain or speak to white people in an inferior manner. Therefore, I cannot be a white racist. This was the argument of my former congregant. She knew what racist behavior was. She didn't engage in it. Therefore, she must not be a white supremacist. Now, I will admit to you, for a while I subscribed to this view myself. It can get really confusing. So here is how I found my way through this. Again, acknowledging that my way is not the only way to understand this stuff, but hopefully it will prove helpful. One distinction that you hear a lot about is the difference between impact and intent. Now, I became interested in this because intent is a pretty important component to Buddhist ethics, as well as many other ethical traditions. There's a difference between the consequences we intend to have around our words and actions versus the actual impact of those words and actions. In other words, we may do something intending to bring about one set of consequences, but at the same time bring about something else we did not intend. Let me give you an example. My dad has in his basement a pool table. Now, if you've ever been on a Zoom call with me for one of those one-on-one meetings or a committee, you've seen the screen I usually have behind me. And some have asked, what's behind this screen? It is his man cave, and the pool table is the center of it. And while I am not ready to challenge Robert Redford, I can play a little pool. In pool, of course, you hit the cue ball into another ball with the goal of getting it into one of the holes on the side of the table called pockets. It involves some strength to give the ball momentum, but there are so many other factors. How long it needs to go, the spin that may be on the ball, where exactly it strikes the ball you're aiming at, whether or not it banks off the rail or into your opponent's ball. The whole premise to pool hinges on the fact that what we intend and what actually happens are not the same thing. If intent and impact were the same, then I would make every shot I take on a pool table. The cue ball would always hit the ball I'm aiming for just in the right way to get it into the pocket. Obviously, that does not happen. More often than not, something close to what I was intending to occur comes about. The cue ball will hit the ball too hard or too soft, or I'll miss it completely and it goes off in another direction. Maybe this errant cue ball hits my opponent's ball and knocks it in instead of mine. In pool, this is called slop, when you hit a ball in that you didn't intend to. This happens in real life too. We say things or do things that we intend to have one consequence come about, but something we didn't intend or foresee happens instead. So let's apply this to race. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never heard anyone ever say that a white person was articulate. I've heard this about Black people from time to time, but never white people. It is, after all, a compliment, or more precisely, it is intended as a compliment. Barack Obama is articulate. That's objectively true. But why not say Bill Clinton is articulate? That's true as well. What goes unsaid is the underlying assumption that African American people maybe don't speak so well or don't sound intelligent. And so the person kind of seems surprised when an African American person does speak with power and authority in a way that they understand. Oh, he's so articulate. Why are you so surprised that you need to make this proclamation? Now, the white person who makes such a claim intends it to be a compliment. However, to a Black person who hears it, they hear not only that intended compliment, but more loudly, the unspoken assumption that the white person doesn't give Black people much credit for speaking or perhaps being intelligent. The intent and the impact of calling a Black person articulate are different. That, by the way, is something called a microaggression, when a white person says something they didn't mean to be racist, but actually reveals that they may have assumed it. Which is one reason, I think, why the definition of the term white supremacy had to expand to include the cultural assumptions we have but may not recognize in ourselves. Another kind of broad example of this, if I can bring in another sport, football. When Colin Kaepernick first took a knee during the national anthem, it was to protest police brutality against the African American community in this country. That was his intent. However, that message got garbled, some may say intentionally twisted, to be an anti-patriotic protest against the flag, the military, and the nation as a whole. After being let go by the 49ers, Kaepernick has never played again in the NFL, despite having been to a Super Bowl. It was only after the death of George Floyd a few months ago that the NFL has recognized that it drew the wrong message from what Kaepernick was trying to convey. Impact and intent were not lined up. Now, by the way, I don't mean to imply in relating all of this that I'm somehow above it or do not make mistakes myself. I do. As a white person in America, I'll probably always have a blind spot where I might say or do something that has an impact on a person of color that I did not intend to have. It happens. And being an anti-racist person means that you're committed to the lifelong spiritual practice of making that blind spot as small as you possibly can. Indeed, in our reading today, my colleague, Reverend Sophia Betancourt, uses the language of salvation to envision a way forward. She says that universalism means that it's possible for all of us to bring about a system that does not have these cultural biases and assumptions towards whiteness. We can envision a form of Unitarian Universalism that does not center the voices, history, and opinions of straight white guys only. It can include everyone. Just to choose an arbitrary group. What if we have a Unitarian Universalism that reflects on our tradition and our values and our principles through the lens of what it means to be Latino or Latina? What would that look like? How cool would that be? Everyone should join the party, not just us as straight white dudes. I want to hear from everyone. We're all connected, Reverend Betancourt reminds us. If one of us is to be saved, then all of us have to be saved. By the way, if you were ever asked who the first female president of the UUA was, the correct answer is Sophia Betancourt. By a matter of months, Susan Frederick Gray was the first elected female president, but Betancourt was 1/3 of the interim co-presidents who initiated a commission to look at the UUA, its staff, its leaders, its culture, to see how we can dismantle white racism. The report they presented at General Assembly last June has become kind of the centerpiece of our reflection for our Allies for Racial Equity group here at the UU Congregation of the Hudson Valley. That commission's report, called Widening the Circle, says, and I quote, "The purpose was to collect stories of those who have been the targets of harm or aggression because of racism within existing UUA culture and identify the aspects of that culture that must be dismantled to transform us into a faith for our time." They note that, quote, "The covenants that bind us together, both within our faith and to our partners in the world, are frayed and broken by the domination of white supremacy culture among us. To keep Unitarian Universalism alive, we must center the voices that have been silenced or drowned out and dismantle elitist and exclusionary white privilege, which inhibits connection and creativity," end quote. In other words, to engage in a process of deep listening with each other. Someone purporting to be St. Francis, 700 years after he died, wrote the prayer that was our meditation, probably as the world was ramping up into World War I. And that prayer, which we usually attribute to him, asks God to help me to seek to understand rather than to be understood. There's perhaps no better antidote to microaggressions than to take this spiritual approach to our anti-racism work. Seek first to understand the other person before trying to interrupt or pontificate on how you see things or how you think things should be. The prayer urges us to take an approach of deep listening for that other person. Now, perhaps St. Francis isn't your cup of tea, or like me, you're more interested in what the real St. Francis said, who's I kind of think of as one of those figures, religious figures that transcend his tradition and are kind of there for all of humanity, maybe a little like the Dalai Lama or something like that. Well, if you're not into St. Francis, no worries, because I think basically St. Francis and my colleague Sophia Betancourt are both saying what Marvin Gaye is singing. Who are they to judge us simply because our hair is long? You know, we got to find a way to bring some understanding here today. And then don't punish me with brutality, just talk to me so you can see what's going on. That whole song is simply a plea to listen to each other. Don't go forward with your assumptions unquestioned. At least be aware of them. Give the other person some credit for good intentions if the impact is perhaps difficult. Let's be generous and forgiving with each other, but also let's try to actively understand each other. Come talk to me so you can see what's going on from my point of view, even if it differs from yours. The video we saw showed some example of urban blight for sure, but it also showed hope. It showed the church as a place for inspiration and comfort. It showed African-American people loving each other, playing together, loving their kids, just like everyone else does. But the trick is to be open and honest and more than a little brave to sit down and have those conversations. It means we have to examine our own assumptions if we are white and be non-defensive when we discover something about ourselves that we wish were not there. That is a super hard thing to do, but it is the only way we grow spiritually, grow as spiritually mature individuals. And it is definitely the only way we grow, as Reverend Betancourt and the Commission point out, as a Unitarian Universalist faith community. If you're interested in learning about what to do and how to go about this, well, you're in luck. Our own Allies for Racial Equity group is sponsoring a series of one-off discussions on various topics related to anti-racism and dismantling white supremacy. These are not huge actions. They're not big commitments. They're simply conversations where we all come together to do some of that deep listening, to learn what's going on. So keep an eye out for one of those that intrigues you. Take a chance. Try it out, even if you've never been to one. It could be transformative. May we all dare to take such risks for our own sake and for the sake of this Unitarian Universalist faith, which we dearly love. May our hearts be filled with love and compassion for all people, regardless of their race or other identity. And may we seek to understand long before we seek to be understood. I love you. Go in peace. Amen. At this time, I invite you to sing hymn number 1015, I Know I Can. The words will appear on your screen.